The encounter. The streets of Zoloft Prime were alive with activity, a constant blur of alien figures moving from one place to another. Hovercrafts zipped overhead, and holographic advertisements beamed in every direction, their bright colors reflecting off the metallic surfaces of the city. It was a place of endless noise, lights, and motion, a place where one could easily be lost, both physically and emotionally. In the corner of a narrow street, amidst the chaos, a small figure huddled. Her frail body trembled, and quiet sobs escaped her lips. The alien girl looked barely 10 years old, her pale blue skin marked with scratches, her clothes torn and dirty. Her large, reflective eyes darted nervously at the crowds passing by. She seemed utterly out of place, a fragile being in a world that didn't seem to care. The passers-by avoided her. Some glanced briefly before looking away, while others pretended not to see her at all. The people of Zoloft Prime were too busy, too preoccupied with their own lives to stop for a crying child. To them, she was just another unfortunate face in a city full of problems. Jack was different. A human trader from Earth, he had only arrived on Zoloft Prime a week ago. He was here for business, hoping to strike a deal with one of the local merchants. His sharp eyes scanned the street as he walked, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and Jack often felt the weight of curious stares on him, but he was used to it by now. As he passed the corner, Jack noticed the small figure. Her quiet sobs barely reached his ears over the noise of the city, but they were enough to stop him in his tracks. He glanced around, expecting someone else to approach her, to help her. But no one did. The crowd flowed around her like water around a rock, indifferent and unfeeling. Jack hesitated. He didn't want to get involved. This wasn't his planet, and he didn't know its rules or customs. For all he knew, stepping in could cause more harm than good. But as he stood there, watching the girl, he felt a pang of guilt. She was just a child, alone and scared. He couldn't ignore that. He took a deep breath and walked toward her. "Hey," Jack said, kneeling down a few feet away from her. His voice was gentle, cautious. He didn't want to frighten her. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her large eyes fixed on him, filled with a mixture of fear and mistrust. She didn't answer. Jack held up his hands, palms open, to show he meant no harm. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." For a moment, there was silence. The girl studied him, her gaze flickering to the crowd as if expecting someone to intervene. But no one did. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why are you talking to me?" she asked. Her words were hesitant, her tone filled with disbelief. Jack frowned. "Because you're sitting here crying, and no one else seems to care." "What happened? Are you hurt?" The girl hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I'm not hurt." Jack noticed the way she avoided his eyes, the way her hands clutched tightly at the fabric of her torn dress. He could tell she wasn't telling the whole truth. "Do you have a name?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. She hesitated again before answering. "Lyra." "Well, Lyra," Jack said, offering her a small smile. "It looks like you could use a friend right now." Lyra's eyes widened slightly at the word friend. It was as if the concept was foreign to her, something she hadn't experienced in a long time, or ever. Before Jack could say more, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A tall, shadowy figure stood across the street, partially hidden by the crowd. The figure was watching them, its gaze fixed on Lyra. Jack's instincts kicked in, and a sense of unease washed over him. "Do you know that person?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the figure. Lyra's face went pale. She didn't look, but her trembling grew worse. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll find me." Jack's concern deepened. "Who's they? What's going on?" "Please," Lyra pleaded, her eyes filled with desperation. "I can't stay here. They'll take me." Jack didn't understand what was happening, But he knew one thing for sure. Lyra was in danger, and she needed help. Without another word, he stood and held out his hand. "Come on," he said firmly. "I'll get you out of here." For a moment, Lyra hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Jack helped her to her feet, and together they began to move through the crowd. The shadowy figure across the street started to follow. As they walked, Jack's mind raced. Who was after her? Why was no one else helping her? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. He had just stepped into something much bigger than he'd expected. The story she tells. Jack led Lyra away from the crowded streets, weaving carefully through narrow alleys until they reached a quieter section of the city. The noise of Zoloft Prime faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of distant hovercrafts and the faint flicker of neon signs overhead. Jack found a bench near a closed vendor stall and gently guided Lyra to sit down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack gave her space, watching her cautiously out of the corner of his eye. She sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes darting nervously at every small sound. Whatever fear had driven her to the streets still lingered like a shadow over her small frame. Jack finally broke the silence. "Lyra, can you tell me what happened?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, fingers trembling as she traced invisible patterns across the metal bench. Jack could see the conflict in her eyes, the hesitation to trust him battling with the weight of whatever secret she carried. After a long pause, her voice came, soft and strained. "They took them, all of them." Jack frowned. "Who took them?" "Your family." Lyra gave a small nod, but her eyes remained downcast. Jack leaned forward slightly, careful not to seem too pushy. "Can you tell me how it happened? I need to understand if I'm going to help you." Lyra hesitated, and then the words began to pour out, faster and heavier with each sentence. "It was 2 nights ago. I woke up because I heard something. Strange, like a low hum, but it wasn't coming from inside the house. It was outside, near the old market." Jack listened closely, noting the tension in her voice. "My parents told me to stay inside, but I couldn't. I followed them." She took a shaky breath. "When I got there, I saw them standing in the street. They were frozen, not moving at all. And there was this light, a blue light that came down from the sky. It wrapped around them." Jack's brows furrowed. "A light? Like a beam?" Lyra nodded slowly. "It pulled them up, one by one. I tried to run to them, but something held me back. I couldn't move. It was like the air had turned heavy around me. I watched as they disappeared, and then the light just vanished." She finally looked at Jack, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No one believed me. When I told the others, they said I was imagining things. They said no one was missing. But I know what I saw. My parents, my brother, they're gone." Jack's stomach tightened. He'd heard rumors of abductions in the outer colonies before, but nothing like this. It wasn't just the description of the light. It was the way she spoke, the raw fear that lingered behind every word. "Why didn't the authorities do anything?" Jack asked, already suspecting the answer. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because we're Nori. No one cares about us." Jack clenched his fists. He had heard of the Nori, a species often treated as second-class citizens across many planets in the sector. They lived in poorer districts, often overlooked and left to fend for themselves. If Lyra's family had vanished, it wouldn't surprise him if no one had lifted a finger to investigate. Jack's voice softened. "You've been on your own since then." Lyra nodded. "I thought if I stayed quiet and out of sight, they wouldn't come for me. But I was wrong. They're still looking." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Who's looking for you?" Lyra opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, Jack's instincts flared. A tall figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the alley, their face obscured beneath a dark hood. Jack immediately recognized the silhouette. It was the same figure who had been watching them earlier. "Stay here," Jack whispered, rising to his feet. Lyra gripped his sleeve. No, don't leave me. If they take you, I'll be alone again. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I'm not going anywhere. I promise. The figure approached slowly, as if testing Jack's reaction. Jack stepped forward, blocking the view of Lyra behind him. Can I help you? Jack asked, his tone calm but firm. The hooded figure stopped a few paces away. Their voice came out in a deep, mechanical tone. You shouldn't involve yourself, human. This doesn't concern you. Jack crossed his arms. A scared kid crying in the street doesn't concern me. I must have missed that memo. The figure took another step forward. Hand her over. Now. Jack's eyes flickered toward Lyra, who shrank back against the bench. He could feel her panic rising. You're not getting her, Jack said firmly, his stance unwavering. There was a long silence, and then the figure spoke again. You don't know what she is, do you? Jack's heart skipped a beat. She's just a kid. The figure chuckled darkly. Is that what you think? Before Jack could respond, the figure turned sharply and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Jack exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. He turned to Lyra, who looked at him with pleading eyes. We need to move, Jack said. Whoever they are, they're not giving up. Lyra stood quickly, staying close to Jack as they left the alley behind. Jack didn't know exactly what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. Lyra wasn't just any ordinary child, and whoever was after her wasn't going to stop until they had her. The chase begins. The streets of Zoloft Prime seemed darker than before, even though the neon lights still flickered overhead. Jack's grip tightened around Lyra's small hand as they moved swiftly through the narrow alleys, his eyes scanning every corner. The encounter with the hooded figure left a bitter taste in his mouth. Whoever they were, they had made one thing clear. Lyra was valuable to someone, and not in a good way. Jack didn't like running blind. He needed answers. Lyra stayed silent, her small footsteps quick but light as she followed closely behind him. Every so often, she glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting the shadowy figure to emerge from the darkness again. Jack, she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. They won't stop. They never do. Jack slowed, crouching down so they were eye level. Who are they, Lyra? You need to tell me everything. Lyra hesitated. Her eyes darted to the alley's entrance, as if she feared someone might overhear. Her voice was barely louder than a breath. They're called the Collectors, she said. They take people who have something special. Jack's brow furrowed. Special? What do you mean by that? Lyra shifted uncomfortably. I don't know how to explain it. My father used to say some Nori are born different, stronger, faster, or with powers that aren't normal. He said I might be one of them, but I never felt different. Until that night. Jack felt the weight of her words settle on him. He had heard similar stories whispered in spaceports and bars, rumors about children with strange abilities disappearing overnight, taken by unknown forces. Most dismissed them as conspiracy theories or alien folklore. But now, standing in front of this frightened child, Jack wasn't so sure. Okay, Jack said, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out. But first, we need to get somewhere safe. Lyra nodded, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. They continued moving, sticking to the shadows as much as possible. Jack led them through winding back streets, past small vendors closing up their shops, and down alleys filled with flickering signs in languages he didn't recognize. The crowds grew thinner as they approached the outskirts of the district. Jack thought they were in the clear, until he heard the sound. It was faint at first, like the distant hum of an engine, but it grew louder with each passing second. Lyra heard it too. She froze, clutching Jack's arm. They're here, she whispered. Jack didn't waste time asking how she knew. He pulled her forward, quickening their pace. A few seconds later, the hum was accompanied by footsteps. Jack glanced over his shoulder and saw two figures emerge from the street behind them. Dressed in dark, flowing robes, they walked with an unsettling calm, their eyes glowing faintly under the streetlights. Jack swore under his breath. He didn't know who these people were, but they weren't ordinary thugs. Faster, Jack urged, practically dragging Lyra along as they rounded a corner. The alley opened into a larger plaza filled with towering statues and old market stalls. Jack scanned the area, searching for an escape route. There, he pointed to a crumbling service tunnel half hidden by stacks of cargo crates. "We can lose them through that tunnel." Lyra hesitated for a brief second, then nodded. They sprinted toward the tunnel, Jack lifting her over the crates blocking the entrance. As soon as they ducked inside, the hum faded. The tunnel was dark, with only the faint glow of bioluminescent moss lining the walls. Jack pressed his back against the cold metal and listened carefully. No footsteps, no humming, just silence. "I think we lost them," Jack whispered. Lyra didn't respond. She crouched next to him, her eyes fixed on the tunnel's entrance. Jack relaxed slightly, but the calm was short-lived. A shadow appeared at the tunnel's mouth, tall and imposing. One of the robed figures stepped inside, their glowing eyes locking directly onto Jack's. Jack's heart pounded. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Lyra, positioning himself between her and the approaching figure. The figure didn't speak. It simply raised a hand, and suddenly the air around them grew heavy, like an invisible force pressing down on Jack's chest. Lyra gasped, gripping his sleeve tightly. Jack gritted his teeth, fighting the strange pressure. He wasn't going to let them take her. Reaching to his belt, Jack drew a compact energy pistol he kept for emergencies. He aimed it directly at the figure. "I don't know who you are," Jack growled, "but I'd think twice before coming any closer." The figure didn't flinch. Its hand remained raised, and the pressure increased. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Before he could fire, Lyra suddenly stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his arm. "No," she said softly. Jack glanced at her in confusion. "Lyra, what are you?" But before he could finish, the faintest pulse of light radiated from her palm. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jack felt the weight pressing down on them instantly lift. The robed figure staggered back, as if something had struck them. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the shadows of the tunnel. Jack lowered his pistol, staring at Lyra in shock. "What was that?" Lyra looked down at her hands, her expression filled with uncertainty and fear. "I don't know," she said quietly. Jack took a deep breath and holstered his weapon. This was bigger than he thought. "We need to find someone who can help," Jack said firmly. "Come on, we can't stay here." As they left the tunnel, Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever power Lyra possessed, it was the reason the collectors were after her. And they weren't going to stop until they had her. Allies and secrets. The tunnel stretched on for what felt like hours, though Jack knew it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Lyra stayed close by his side, her small footsteps echoing faintly in the confined space. The weight of what he had just witnessed gnawed at him. She had done something impossible. Jack had seen a lot during his travels across the galaxy. Advanced tech, strange creatures, ancient relics of civilizations long gone. But nothing like this. The faint pulse of energy that radiated from Lyra wasn't mechanical, and it didn't seem like ordinary alien abilities either. It felt different. "You doing okay?" Jack asked, keeping his voice light to ease the tension. Lyra nodded but kept her eyes down. "I didn't mean to do it," she said quietly. "It just happens sometimes." Jack frowned. "You've done that before." She hesitated. "Not like that. I didn't know I could." Pushed them away. Jack glanced at her, his mind racing. What exactly was she capable of? The tunnel opened up into a dimly lit industrial district. The buildings here were old, their metal frames rusting at the edges. Large pipes snaked along the walls, releasing occasional hisses of steam. This part of Zoloth Prime felt abandoned, but Jack knew better. People didn't live here, they hid here. "We're going to see someone," Jack said, guiding Lyra toward a side street. "An old friend of mine. She might be able to help us." Lyra looked up at him with a hint of uncertainty. "Can we trust her?" Jack smirked. "Trust is a tricky thing in this part of the galaxy, but Dr. Illen's one of the good ones. If anyone can figure out what's going on with you, it's her." The building they approached looked like an old factory, but Jack knew it was far from ordinary. He knocked twice on the large metal door and waited. A few seconds later, a voice crackled over an intercom. "Go away. I'm busy." Jack grinned. "Ellen, it's me." A long pause followed before the door hissed open. The interior of the lab was cluttered with strange devices, flickering screens, and stacks of data pads. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Illen, a short, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair tied back in a loose bun. She wore a long coat, covered in burn marks and smudges of oil. Illen crossed her arms the moment she saw Jack. "You've got a habit of showing up when I least expect you." "Nice to see you too," Jack replied with a grin. "I brought a friend." Illen's gaze shifted to Lyra. Her expression softened slightly, but Jack could tell she was already analyzing the girl with those piercing eyes. "What's the story?" Ellen asked, gesturing for them to sit. Jack didn't hold back. He explained everything. How he found Lyra in the streets, the hooded figures, the strange energy pulse. Illen listened carefully, occasionally typing on one of the nearby consoles. When Jack finished, Illen leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the table. "Collectors," she muttered under her breath. "I thought those were just stories." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You know about them?" Illen nodded. "Not much. Rumors, mostly. They show up in the outer colonies, take people with unusual traits, and vanish. No one knows where they come from or why they do it." She turned her attention to Lyra. "And you, kid, you're at the center of this." Lyra shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't ask for this." Illen's expression softened. "I know. But whatever's inside you, it's powerful. And people like the collectors, they'll do anything to control it." Jack frowned. "Can you figure out what's going on with her?" Illen stood and grabbed a handheld scanner from one of the cluttered shelves. "Let's see." Lyra sat still as Illen ran the scanner over her. The device emitted a soft hum, and strange patterns flickered on the screen. Illen's brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. "Jack," she said slowly, "this isn't normal." Jack leaned over to see. "What am I looking at?" Illen turned the screen toward him. "There's an energy signature running through her cells. It's not mechanical, and it's not natural. It's woven into her DNA, almost like it's been there since birth." Jack glanced at Lyra. She looked as confused as he felt. "So what does that mean?" Jack asked. Illen hesitated. "I think Lyra is part of something ancient. There are stories about certain species developing abilities over generations, but nothing on this level. This energy, if refined, could rival some of the most advanced tech in the galaxy." Lyra's eyes widened in fear. "I don't want it." Illen crouched down to her level. "I know, but it's part of you, and that means you have to learn to control it. If you don't, the collectors won't stop coming." Jack stood, arms crossed. "So, what do we do now?" Illen sighed, standing up. "I can keep her hidden here for a while, but it's only a matter of time before they find this place. You need to get her somewhere safer." Jack nodded. "I know a few places off-world that could work." Illen handed Jack a small data chip. "This has information on the energy signature I detected. If you meet someone who knows more about ancient tech, show them this. Maybe they can help." Jack pocketed the chip and turned to Lyra. "You ready to get out of here?" Lyra nodded, but her expression was still uncertain. "Jack, why are you helping me?" Jack smiled gently. "Because someone has to. And I'm not about to let them take you without a fight." As they left Illen's lab, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far bigger and far more dangerous. confronting the threat. The cold night air of Zoloft Prime wrapped around Jack and Lyra as they stepped out of Dr. Elan's lab and into the silent streets. The industrial district stretched out before them, cloaked in shadows and faint flickers of neon light. Jack's mind raced as he processed Elan's words. Lyra's power wasn't just rare, it was ancient. He glanced at the small girl walking beside him. Lyra kept her head down, arms crossed tightly as if trying to make herself invisible. Jack could see the weight pressing on her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I don't feel different. I don't understand why this is happening to me." Jack sighed. "Neither do I. But we'll figure it out, one step at a time." As they walked further, Jack felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His instincts sharpened, and he subtly guided Lyra toward a quieter path between two empty warehouses. "We're not alone," Jack said softly, his eyes scanning the rooftops and alleys. Lyra tensed but said nothing. In the distance, Jack spotted them, two dark figures trailing behind, their steps silent but steady. A faint hum lingered in the air, the same sound he heard before during their first encounter. Collectors. Jack gritted his teeth. They're not wasting time. Lyra's hand tightened around his arm. "Jack, we should run." "No," Jack replied firmly. "We're done running." Lyra looked up at him in surprise, but Jack's expression was set. He had faced worse odds before. If the collectors wanted Lyra, they'd have to go through him first. Jack guided her into an old, abandoned courtyard. Crumbling walls and rusted machinery surrounded them, providing cover but limiting their escape routes. It wasn't ideal, but Jack wasn't looking to escape. He was looking to end this. "Stay behind me," Jack ordered as he positioned Lyra near a large metal crate. He drew his energy pistol, the barrel glowing faintly in the dark. The two figures entered the courtyard, moving slowly, deliberately. Jack could see their eyes glowing beneath their hoods, reflecting like stars in the night. One of the figures stepped forward and spoke in that cold, mechanical tone. "You had your chance, human. Hand the girl over, and we'll let you walk away." Jack smirked, keeping his aim steady. "Yeah, I don't think so. You see, I'm not the kind of guy who takes threats lightly." The second figure raised a hand, and Jack immediately felt the air thicken around him. The same crushing pressure from before returned, weighing him down as if invisible chains wrapped around his body. Jack gritted his teeth and fought against it. "You're gonna have to try harder than that." A spark of light flickered in the corner of his eye. Lyra, the faint glow around her fingertips began to build, just like it had in the tunnel. Lyra's eyes widened, and Jack saw the fear returning. "Lyra," Jack said calmly, "I know you're scared, but you can control this." "I don't know how," she stammered. Jack shifted his stance, the weight pressing heavier on his shoulders. "You don't have to. Just trust me." Lyra took a shaky breath. The glow around her hands intensified, and the pressure around Jack lessened slightly. The lead collector's voice hardened. "She doesn't know the danger she carries. If you let her live, she will become something even she cannot control." Jack's finger hovered over the trigger. "Funny, you sound a lot like someone afraid of losing." The second collector stepped forward, energy crackling around their hands. Jack's eyes narrowed. They weren't here to negotiate anymore. Before the collector could strike, Jack fired. A bright blue energy bolt sliced through the air, but the collector twisted to the side, narrowly dodging it. The second figure lunged forward, their movements unnaturally fast. Jack dropped low, sweeping Lyra behind him as he fired again. This time, the bolt struck the collector's shoulder, sending them staggering backward. Lyra gasped, clutching at Jack's jacket. "I've got this," Jack assured her, stepping in front as the lid collector advanced. The collector raised his hand, but before he could unleash his power, Lyra's glow exploded outward. A shockwave rippled through the courtyard, knocking both collectors backward. The pressure in the air dissipated, and the glowing light around Lyra faded as quickly as it had appeared. Lyra collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. Jack crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You did good," he said softly. The collectors slowly rose to their feet, but something had changed. They no longer advanced. Instead, the lead collector fixed his glowing eyes on Lyra. "This is not over," he warned. "The power within her will continue to grow, and when it does, we will return." Jack stepped in front of Lyra, his energy pistol aimed squarely at the collector's chest. "Next time, I'll be ready." Without another word, the collectors retreated, their forms vanishing into the shadows of the night. Lyra shivered slightly as Jack helped her to her feet. "Jack," she whispered, "what if they're right? What if I lose control?" Jack met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "You won't, because you're not alone anymore." Lyra nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. As they left the courtyard, Jack knew the battle wasn't over. The collectors would come again, but for now, Lyra was safe. And that was enough. A dangerous gamble. The air in the aftermath felt heavier, as if the weight of the confrontation lingered long after the collectors had disappeared into the shadows. Jack led Lyra through the winding streets of Zoloft Prime, his grip firm but reassuring. He could feel the tension radiating off her. She walked silently, her small hand trembling in his. "Jack, what if they come back tonight?" Lyra's voice was small, barely louder than the hum of distant engines. Jack glanced down at her. "They might," he admitted honestly. "But they won't catch us off guard again." Lyra looked unconvinced. "I hurt them. I didn't mean to. But I don't know how to stop it." Jack stopped walking and knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me, Lyra. Whatever's inside you, it's part of who you are. But it doesn't have to control you. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone anymore, okay?" Her eyes met his, wide and fearful, but she gave a small nod. As they continued moving, Jack's mind raced. The collectors weren't going to stop. That much was clear. And hiding wasn't going to be a permanent solution. Sooner or later, he'd have to confront them directly. Or worse, find a way to outsmart them. But how do you outsmart someone who seemed to know your every move? Jack needed an advantage, something that would tilt the odds in their favor. After a few blocks, they arrived at a small, run-down spaceport tucked away from the main avenues. Rusted freighters and forgotten cargo crates littered the area. But Jack knew a few pilots who frequented this spot. Pilots who didn't ask questions. As they entered the port, Jack scanned the docks until his eyes landed on a familiar ship. The Shadow Dancer was a sleek, battered smuggler's vessel, painted matte black with barely visible insignias. Its captain, Calendros, was leaning against the boarding ramp, smoking something that smelled faintly toxic. Callan was an old friend, if Jack could call him that. Callan spotted Jack immediately, smirking as he exhaled a plume of smoke. "Jack Carter, I thought you finally got yourself spaced." Jack smirked. "Not yet. I need a favor." Callan chuckled. "You always do. What's the catch?" Jack stepped aside, allowing Callan to see Lyra. The smuggler's expression shifted slightly, his smirk fading. "This isn't your usual cargo, Jack," Callan said carefully. Jack crossed his arms. "No, she isn't, but I need to get her off-world. Tonight." Callan scratched his chin, eyeing Lyra with suspicion. "What did you get yourself into this time?" Jack glanced around, lowering his voice. "The collectors." Callan's eyes narrowed. He flicked his cigarette aside. "Collectors? You're messing with dangerous people, Jack. They don't take kindly to interference." "I'm aware," Jack replied. "But I don't have much of a choice." Callan sighed, eyeing Lyra once more. "All right, I'll take you both off-world, but it'll cost you." Jack smirked. "I figured as much." Before they could board, Lyra tugged on Jack's sleeve. "Jack, I don't want to leave Dr. Ellen behind. She helped us." Jack knelt down. "I know, but she can handle herself. Right now, we need to focus on keeping you safe." Lyra hesitated but nodded reluctantly. As they approached the boarding ramp, a sudden chill crept over Jack's spine. Something wasn't right. The spaceport was quiet, too quiet. Jack turned his head slightly, scanning the area. He caught sight of faint movement near the far side of the docks. Silhouettes emerged from behind stacked crates. The collectors. Kalen saw them too. "Jack, tell me you didn't lead them here." Jack pulled Lyra behind him. "I didn't have much of a choice." The lead collector stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly under the dim port lights. "This is your last chance, Carter." The collector's cold voice echoed across the dock. "Hand over the girl." Jack drew his pistol. "I'd rather die." The collector's gaze hardened. "That can be arranged." Before the words had fully left his mouth, the air shimmered around him. A blast of blue energy erupted from his palm, surging toward Jack and Lyra. Jack shoved Lyra behind a crate, ducking just in time to avoid the searing blast. Callan cursed, drawing a rifle from the side of his ship. "I didn't sign up for this." Jack fired twice, but the collectors moved with inhuman speed, dodging the bolts with ease. One of them closed the distance between them frighteningly fast, reaching for Jack with crackling energy in his fingertips. Before he could strike, Lyra's glow returned. A sudden pulse of light rippled outward, knocking the advancing collector off his feet. Lyra's eyes flared with bright energy as she stared down at the enemies. Breathing heavily, Jack shielded his eyes from the blast, blinking as the light faded. The collector who had fallen scrambled back, his expression unreadable. The lead figure narrowed his glowing eyes at Lyra, but didn't advance further. "She is more powerful than we thought," he said calmly, brushing dust off his robe. "This is not over, human. We will return." With that, the collectors retreated into the shadows, disappearing as silently as they had come. Kalen lowered his rifle, exhaling sharply. "I hate when they do that." Jack approached Lyra, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" Lyra looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted them to stop." Jack gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You did good, kid. Really good." Kalen shook his head, waving them toward the ship. "Let's get out of here before they change their minds." As the shadow dancer lifted off from Zoloft Prime, Jack watched the planet shrink beneath them. He knew the collectors weren't gone for good. But for now, Lyra was safe, and that was all that mattered. Aftermath and hope. The shadow dancer sliced through the dark void of space, its engines humming steadily as Zoloft Prime faded into a distant speck behind them. Jack sat in the corner of the ship's small cargo bay, leaning against a crate with Lyra curled up beside him, her head resting lightly on his arm. The soft glow of hyperspace stretched endlessly outside the small viewing window, casting faint reflections across the room. Kalen sat at the helm, occasionally glancing over his shoulder at them. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by quiet unease. Jack could feel it too. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air, like a storm cloud waiting to break. "You really know how to pick your problems, Jack," Kalen muttered as he adjusted the ship's course. "This isn't like running from local bounty hunters. The collectors don't stop. Ever." Jack's eyes didn't leave the stars outside. "I know." Kalen's gaze flicked briefly to Lyra. "And you're sure she's worth the trouble?" Jack finally looked over at him, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, she is." Lyra shifted slightly but remained asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Jack could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the kind that went deeper than just lack of sleep. She had been running for so long that she probably forgot what it felt like to rest without fear. Jack sighed, lowering his voice. "She's just a kid, Kalen. They would have torn her apart to get whatever's inside her. I couldn't let that happen." Kalen grunted. "I get it. But what's the plan now? You can't outrun them forever." Jack ran a hand through his hair. That was the part he hadn't figured out yet. Dr. Illen's words echoed in his mind. Lyra's power is ancient. If the collectors were after her, That meant whatever she carried inside her wasn't just rare. It was dangerous. But dangerous to whom? Jack glanced at the small data chip Elin had given him, now tucked safely in his pocket. Somewhere out there was someone who could give them answers. "We're going to the outer reaches," Jack finally said. Kalen raised an eyebrow. "The reaches? You're kidding. Half those planets are barely livable, and the other half are crawling with pirates." Jack met his gaze, unflinching. "I know someone out there. If anyone can help Lyra, it's him." Kalen let out a low whistle. "Fine. But you're paying me double." Jack smirked faintly. "You say that every time." The conversation fell into silence again, save for the soft hum of the ship. Jack leaned back, feeling Lyra shift closer to his side. "Jack," she mumbled sleepily, barely loud enough for him to hear. "I'm here," he replied, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Get some rest. We're safe for now." Lyra's eyes fluttered open for just a second. "Thank you for not leaving me." Jack's chest tightened slightly. He remembered that look, the quiet hope hidden beneath the fear. She had been abandoned before, too many times. "I'm not leaving," Jack said softly, "no matter what happens." Lyra smiled faintly and drifted back to sleep. Hours later, the Shadow Dancer emerged from hyperspace, the ship dropping into a system far beyond the reach of galactic authorities. The planet below was small and mostly covered in dense forests and towering mountains. Jack recognized it instantly. Naris V. "This is the place," Kalen asked as he guided the ship toward a landing platform nestled within the trees. Jack nodded. "Yeah, an old friend of mine lives down there. He doesn't trust outsiders. But he owes me a favor." Kalen snorted. "They always do." The ship touched down gently, and Jack stood, stretching his legs. Lyra stirred beside him, rubbing her eyes. "Where are we?" she asked groggily. "Somewhere safe," Jack replied. "At least for now." As the ramp lowered, warm air and the scent of damp earth filled the cargo bay. Lyra hesitated at the top of the ramp, gazing out at the unfamiliar landscape. "Come on," Jack said, offering his hand. "Let's meet our next ally." Lyra took his hand without hesitation this time. As they stepped onto solid ground, a figure emerged from the tree line. He was tall, draped in patchwork robes, and carried a long staff. His face was hidden beneath a worn hood, but Jack recognized him immediately. "It's been a long time, Jack Carter," the figure said, lowering his hood to reveal a scared, weathered face. His eyes, however, were sharp and full of wisdom. "Good to see you, Tarek," Jack replied with a grin. "I need your help." Tarek's gaze shifted to Lyra, and his expression darkened slightly. "I can see that," he said grimly. "You brought more than just trouble this time." Jack placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "She's special, Tarek, and the people after her won't stop." Tarek knelt in front of Lyra, studying her carefully. After a long pause, he stood and nodded. "Come inside," he said simply. "We have much to discuss." As they followed Tarek deeper into the forest, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The collectors would come again, of that he was certain. But Jack also knew something else. Lyra wasn't just running from them anymore. She was learning to stand and fight.